Hi, welcome to our monthly webinar. Today we're talking about a topic that's commonly misunderstood, security architecture views. These are 4 views that are required for a submission to the FDA, and they're good views in general because they really help you look at your system's architecture from a security lens and a couple different lenses within that overall security lens. So I'm here with our co-host, Trevor. How's it going today, Trevor?
It's going pretty well. It's a nice sunny day today, which is a nice change. But yeah, excited to talk about some architecture views, which can be a little bit of a tricky concept at times with the FDA.
Yeah, awesome. We had my first ever monsoon or whatever that I've experienced in Phoenix last night. It blew like all the furniture off my deck and broke a couple of the neighbors' windows. There's glass all over. A couple of palm trees are down. It's pretty crazy.
Wow. Yeah, I saw some videos online. That huge dust storm looked pretty intense.
Yeah, that's what rolled right over my property here.
Yeah, I saw it seemed to sort of hit dead center of Tempe. So I guess you were right in the crossfire there.
That's right. I am in the dead center of Tempe pretty much. Cool. Well, let's go ahead and get started here on the security architecture views.
All right. The first thing that we'll cover is just a little bit of a summary of what architecture views are and why this is important for the FDA. So, as you mentioned, these are required by the FDA for successful submissions. There are 4 different views, and we'll get into some of the details on each of these, but the goal of all of these views is to capture how security is designed in the products at various states, in various components, through various use cases. Now, the 4 main views that we need to consider are the global system view, multi-patient harm view, updatability and patchability view, and secure use case views. We'll talk about what each of those mean in a second. For developing the architecture views, there are a couple of different recognized ways that the FDA will accept the documentation. And this can be either integrated into threat modeling or prepared as standalone deliverables. Now, this can be a very easy integration into your threat modeling, since you can often use the same diagram for a global system view and a threat model diagram if you're capturing the appropriate level of detail, the right data flows and connections, and then you just have to map applicable threats to each of those components. You can even go down into some of the other views and discuss how threats would map to different use cases or scenarios. Now, generally, when we're preparing this documentation, we try to separate them out a little bit more while still having traceability back to the component, just so that we have the division between the documents and separate deliverables. They still interact and tie in together very closely. Now, either approach is accepted by the FDA, and either approach is going to lead to the same level of success, whether these are prepared as standalone documents or prepared as part of overall threat model documentation.
These security architecture views in general support a secure product development framework, or DevSecOps. Would you agree with that?
I would. Having security integrated into your architecture views is an artifact of secure coding practices. It's an artifact of developers taking security seriously and ensuring that they're covering all of their bases on these difficult topics. So if you have an architecture view where you take a look and you're not sure how security is mapped to any of these components, you're not sure where there's risk in your device based off of these architecture views, that's a little bit of a difficult situation compared to having a clear, concise understanding of exactly what needs to go into play there. If you take a look at these views and you see security's been addressed through multiple different states of the device, security's been covered in different operational functions of the device, that's a good indication that you've been addressing security from the top down.
And I know we're focusing on the FDA because these are the requirements of the FDA. The same exercise of going through all these views strengthens your submission for any other regulatory authorities, such as EU MDR. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, yeah, very similar documentation requirements across a lot of these global regulators, and conveying how security is built into your system is going to be applicable across many different submissions. So this would work great if you're going not only for that FDA submission in the US, but the MDR in Europe, if you're looking for the PMDA in Japan, the MDFS in Korea, if you're looking for submissions in Middle East, Australia, Singapore, Thailand, all of these have similar requirements. Obviously, there are some differences in testing processes, labeling documentation, things like that are usually where we're going to see the most distinction. But this is a fairly standardized approach, how we're addressing these architecture views. All right, I'll get a little bit more into what each of these views are. So The global system view is an overview of all the core components and, importantly, external actors interacting with the system. External actors can mean a few different things. This could be a user, this could be a third-party integration. Let's say you're hooking into some service for capturing runtime logs in the device. That would be considered an external actor. It's any system, any component, or any user that operates with the device outside of the device itself. Now, while that's very important, we have to make sure that everything in the device is captured to a great level of detail as well. That's going to make up our overall global system view. The multi-patient harm view, we're capturing specific situations or specific use cases where a single compromise or attack can affect multiple users or devices. This is going to be very broad and unique based on the device. Every device has a unique risk profile, and every device is going to have unique multi-patient harm views. We'll talk about some examples of common ones and ways to mitigate them in a bit here. Updatability and patchability view is how we talk about where security is built into the update process and how these are pushed out to fielded devices. Security is extremely important when we're addressing updates. Now, updates can often be a little bit of a security sensitive topic due to the fact that the process can be so easily compromised. Update infrastructure can often be vulnerable to cybersecurity vulnerabilities, even more so than the device itself. So we want to make sure that security is addressed throughout the entire update process, through the users interacting with the update process, through the developers on the internal side of things. It needs to be an end-to-end view. Security use case views are directed towards specific use cases and operational states and how we're addressing security into them. There is a lengthy list of recommendations provided by the FDA on what should be addressed here, though in general, we want to look at any state of the device and how the data flows are working during that state. So for an example, if we have Bluetooth, USB, and HDMI, how are those all going to have different security profiles during normal operation, during standby, during power off, during power on? These are the type of things that we're looking at with our security use case views. Global system views are, as I mentioned, meant to cover the end-to-end scope of the medical device. When we're saying end-to-end, this is everything that could be foreseeably seen to interact with the device during normal operation, all standard users, any interoperable components. It needs to cover everything that will be involved with the device ecosystem, even if the manufacturer doesn't control it.
This is basically all interactions, either through a human or data flows, so it's logical or physical interactions with the device, effectively.
Yes.
From anything it's supposed to interact with, and even things it's not supposed to interact with.
Exactly. And this will include the internal components as well. So how are these internal components communicating and interacting with each other? So it has to be a very comprehensive view. This is the most general view, but needs to have a lot of detail since we are covering such a large amount of information here. One common misconception is, should this be focused on software? Should this be focused on hardware components? And the answer is both. Global system views cannot be confined to just one area. It should be essentially a blend of software architecture, hardware architecture, and data flows. We need to cover the overall global end-to-end system and every component within it. This means that it's going to have a very wide scope as far as what the architecture view can capture, and that's why this can often be a little bit difficult to accurately convey the device. In addition to the view itself, the diagram for the architecture view, we should have accurate descriptions and an explanation on what is covered in this diagram. Presenting an architecture diagram to the FDA is not always going to be enough information for them to understand how security is mapped to the components and what the components are all doing. So having some descriptions and documentation in place on what is happening with any of these components is very important. This is an example of a global system view that could also be used for threat modeling. I know I mentioned earlier that oftentimes there's going to be a fair amount of overlap here. And what we're trying to do is capture the physical components, the logical components, as well as the data flows between them. Now, this is adhering to the DFD3 standard, which is required for threat modeling documentation, but it is not required for global system views. If you are blending your architecture views and your threat modeling, we do recommend that you adhere to the DFD3 standard to be compliant with the MITRE playbook for threat modeling medical devices.
That's the data flow diagram version 3 standard.
Yes. And what we're capturing here is anything physical as far as the entry points, USB points, JTAG interfaces, things like that, as well as any internal components. So for an example, if we have like a central control unit, if we have any processors or data storage on the inside, we want to capture that as key components within the system, as well as anyone who's interacting with it during normal operation, as well as where they're interacting with it. Next view that I want to talk about is the multi-patient harm view. I think this is one that can get the most complicated in some ways, and oftentimes has the most misunderstandings associated with it. This is essentially any scenario or situation that we can capture where compromise of a single device, a single user, a single component is going to lead to the compromise of multiple devices or multiple users.
So let's go back for a second to contrast these two, because this is, I think a lot of people are confused about these two, because when we think about global, often I hear people think about, like, on a global scale, if this device is attacked, can it affect multiple patients globally? But that is not what we're saying.
Correct. The global system view is meant to be the view of the, I guess if you imagine the system as your infrastructure, the system as your entire setup, it's the global view of that system. So it's essentially just trying to say global in terms of capturing everything, as opposed to like wide reach, which is usually where we're factoring in the multi-patient harm view instead.
Right. So global system view, we're talking about everything that system interoperates with, like I said, physically or logically on a global scale, and also to include the internal components of how they interact with each other for the product.
Yep, exactly. The multi-patient harm view is then going to be a little bit more siloed to specific situations or specific problems. So the focus going away from the global system view becomes much more narrow for the rest of the different architecture views that we capture.
So the multi-patient harm view, I think, is a critical one to discuss, because the whole idea is, if I am able to compromise one system, can I affect multiple patients? Or one vulnerability, I should say. They're sort of like with shell shock or log, what is it, log4?
Log4j.
Log4j. I went for a run earlier today. I'm a little bit exhausted, I guess, mentally. Log4j. But if that compromises one medical device, then technically it could compromise that same device to multiple healthcare delivery organizations, which could affect multiple patients. Is that the lens we're looking through here, or a little bit different?
Definitely. And there are some other situations that we have to capture as well. We have some examples that we'll dive into in a second, but we're talking about situations where, ransomware is a hot topic for medical devices, for critical infrastructure. If a device gets ransomwared, what other devices on that network will also be ransomwared? That's something that we can think about from a multi-patient harm view angle as well. And of course, it's going to be very device specific. Some devices may not connect into the network, so they're not going to be a great candidate for ransomware. Some devices may be entirely cloud hosted, and so they aren't going to interact with internal networks. There's a range of how multi-patient harm views can apply, which is why it's going to be so unique based on the device. If we're looking at something like
let me pause there for a second. A question that comes up quite a bit, because I see on the bullet there, if I'm a medical device manufacturer and somebody compromises my device, in what way can I figure out what the effect would be to other devices or users?
That is a little bit of a difficult situation to cover. Oftentimes, it just requires expertise in the security space, understanding how similar vulnerabilities have worked in the past. But there can be some characteristics of specific attacks. I'll jump over to the next slide here where we have some of these examples. And I'll actually start at the bottom and we can work our way back up. So hard-coded credentials, for an example. This is something we see in, I would say, 80+% of devices that would be a multi-patient harm scenario. A hard-coded credential is something baked into the code where there's a password or a key used to authenticate into some service or some account. And if that is compromised, it can often be applicable across all of the same device if it's been hard-coded. So that would be an example of hack into one device, hack into all of them.
The same product by the same manufacturer. Because one of the first medical devices I've worked on, I think this was in 2014, had this exact problem where the field technicians had a hard-coded password in order to get into the device. And one of them posted it on the internet so he would have easy access to it, but it was openly accessible, and we were able to find that. So basically, somebody could get into every single device from that manufacturer using that password in maintenance mode.
Yep. And it's unfortunately way too common to see hard-coded credentials present in medical devices. It's easily caught by static testing tools, but it's not at the front of mind for a lot of developers, which is why we emphasize the security by design approach as opposed to trying to bolt it on at the end. Some of the other situations that can come up outside of compromise of a network device that spreads out into other devices, I always like to talk about the compromise of one user account compromising other user accounts. This would be broken authentication or broken access control. What we're essentially saying here is there's a design flaw where someone can access someone else's information, or one level of privilege can access a higher level of privilege. While this is still confined to a single device or a single system, it is going to lead to the compromise of multiple patients through a single exploit. And as such, we want to consider that as a multi-patient harm view as well.
So is it safe to say, if I have a product that's a physical product, the risk is less from a multi-patient harm view than if I have a product that's on the cloud with multiple organizations using that product on the cloud?
I think it's more going to depend on what your device is doing and how it's interacting with different components around it. Multi-patient harm views are going to be applicable to almost every device. And so it's just a matter of which ones specifically are going to be tied to that device. I don't think there's one that's a safer bet than the other in most cases.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know some of our clients have a system on the cloud that multiple healthcare delivery organizations connect to. And it seems like the likelihood of having multi-patient harm on that one, since it has multiple patients on the cloud, is more than like a drug infusion pump, as example. I know I didn't provide all the context for your answer, but that's kind of, if I look at it through that lens, I would say it's more on the cloud based than the drug infusion pump.
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot more that can go wrong on the cloud side of things. And so it's more likely that you'll have problems. We've even seen some solutions and workarounds to this, like having individual tenants for different clients. So let's say that a service provider has a cloud-based solution that they want to sell into different healthcare delivery organizations. They make their own tenant for each HDO, and that prevents the risk of multi-patient harm scenarios by tying it more to an individual organization and having less risk of storing all sorts of data in one place. So there are a lot of different solutions to this. Some alternatives are just ensuring that your access control is extremely well configured in your application, though it can be a little bit of a risky approach since it just takes one problem to essentially lead to this full compromise.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, the whole reason we're looking at these different views is so we can come up with a solution to minimize the risk. Like you just talked about, the multi-tenant solution for something on the cloud.
Yep, exactly. So that's the whole point of this, is to capture different harm scenarios and how they're designed out of the system. We can go ahead and jump into updatability and patchability views. Now, I always think it's funny whenever I write updatability, I'm not sure that's actually a word. It always triggers all of my spell checkers to say like, hey, you need to rewrite that. So
the FDA made it up.
Exactly. Maybe it's an FDA made up word. But what we're trying to do with these views is talk about how the device handles the update process and how security is covered in that update process. It's a little bit unique depending on the device. Obviously, every device is going to receive updates in a different way. But however that device is receiving updates, we need to figure out how security has been baked into it.
Is it safe to say that one of the primary, I guess, drivers for updatability and patchability view is the SolarWinds attack?
Yeah, that was a big snit. Because
we're looking at securing the supply chain for the updatability and patchability as well, right? That's one of the considerations.
Exactly. So with all of the components that'll tie into the update and patchability process, what the FDA is trying to do, and they are encouraging that devices have update functionality. It's highly, highly encouraged, even though update infrastructure, update functionality can introduce its own level of risk. But the ability to remove risks in the device through over-the-air updates is often a greater benefit than the drawbacks of having the potential risk through compromise of that update infrastructure.
Is it safe to say, because this is a question that a lot of clients bring up, that OTA is less secure than having to physically send a field tech to plug a USB device in to do the update? Is there one? I know you can, and I'm not providing a lot of context, and of course you can secure one and not the other, but in general, what would you say from our experience?
In general, there's a little bit more that can go wrong with over-the-air updates, since you have to consider security for that over-the-air infrastructure as well. Usually that's a cloud-hosted update server, and that can be compromised. The compromise and the downstream effects of that server can be massive. So
Yeah.
there's a higher risk. Obviously, there's a higher benefit to it as well. You don't need to send out a field technician to every site to manually put on a patch. Oftentimes, you think about some devices can have hundreds or thousands of different instances out in the field. Sending out a service technician to all of those has a very long rollout time. And we often see rollout cycles lasting for as long as 3 to 6 months with more complicated systems, even from very large companies with the staff to manage it. So there are pros and cons to each approach for sure. And there are security considerations for each as well.
Yeah, I remember one of our clients there, as you mentioned the infrastructure that supports the over-the-air update. They had their over-the-air update infrastructure. It was connected to their corporate environment, which obviously is not a secure updatability or patchability environment, because the HR person is sitting next to the person's logically on the say network to the person that's developing the update. So that's one of the things we have to consider also if we do an OTA, right?
Definitely. We want to make sure this is an isolated process outside of anything else. Having it sandboxed into that one area just removes a little bit of the risk of, like you said, what if someone in HR gets compromised and then they can jump off into an adjacent network? If there are no adjacent networks, obviously that risk just completely goes away. So isolating update infrastructure and processes as much as possible helps build in a little bit more inherent security.
And this for a physical update via a USB drive. What are some of the controls people can put in place to make sure that that is a secure process?
Well, if it's over a USB drive, the assumption is the device has to have a USB port. That is often one of the easiest ways of compromise when we're interacting with a physical device is through USB interfaces. And this can be through, if we're using update on a thumb drive, we might not need to allow, say, a keyboard to connect to it. So we can try to restrict what types of devices can interact with that interface. We might say that we should check for a key on the update drive before we'll read it or recognize it. Or we might say you can put a physical lock on the USB port and service technicians are given the key. There's a pretty wide range of things that we can do to address security on the physical process, but it's still very important to address. And even things like a USB port for an update process can introduce a lot of risk into a device.
Yeah, and I guess it doesn't have to be USB. It could be Bluetooth or some other mechanism as well for a physical update. I know one of our clients in the past, they used this software that basically did whitelisting of what type and what manufacturer of USB drive could be put into the device for the updates. That was their solution. I don't know if that's the most effective because there's a lot of overhead in the device, but that's what they came up with.
Yep, and there are a lot of different ways to go about that process. We've seen solutions like that where we whitelist. You can even whitelist a specific brand of USB thumb drive and then pick something pretty obscure so that only service technicians have it. We've seen physical locks on devices and then a key. Even just epoxying ports shut can be a solution on some cases. And so there are a lot of different ways to go about this. Everything has varying benefits as far as the usability of the device. For an example, epoxying a port shut, you probably won't get much use out of it. And a physical lock can add some inconvenience to the process, but adds another layer of security. And then using USB whitelisting is a fairly, non-impactful approach in regards to functionality for the device. While it still needs to be considered on the business side of things, since you have to source specific USB keys, you have to make sure that service technicians only use those. There's always a layer of complexity added by security, unfortunately. And I think this is a view where that really starts to show. Awesome. Well, we'll take a look at some of the next views here and what some of the examples are with updatability and patchability. So I know we talked a little bit about this process, but some of the things that we want to consider here would be diagrams and associated descriptions for everything in that process. The device itself, security states during update. We're going to talk about our security use case views in a second here, but that's where we're talking about different operational states. So what is the device doing while it's receiving updates? How are we validating an update package is intact and secure? How are we securing that infrastructure? You can even go all the way down to the human level. What development practices should you adhere to make sure that you're designing good code, you aren't designing risk into the device through the update practices, and you don't have any malicious insiders? How can you verify that your service technicians rolling out updates are addressing security? They aren't leaving their laptops unlocked and these USB keys out in the open while they, go to the bathroom or go get some water or something like that. There's a lot that can go into this, and the considerations can actually go pretty deep when you're considering this all the way down to the manufacturing level.
Yeah, one of these that stands out for me, because I know we've been able to compromise devices in this way, is that second bullet there, the security states during the update. Because I know with quite a few devices, we're able to reboot the device and then boot off an operating system off of the thumb drive, which should not be allowed, basically, because then we can read whatever's on that system through the operating system off the thumb drive.
Yep. Yeah, that's I would say one of our unfortunately far too common vulnerabilities. One of our most common ones that we see is being able to sideload operating systems. Things in the BIOS aren't protected. The OS operating or the OS update process might not be protected, since that's usually going to break us out of any like kiosk mode or sandboxing that we're in. And so security states can get far weaker during update processes if they're not properly addressed. The next view is going to be the security use case views. And these can be just about anything. That's why we'll talk about some of the examples, but pretty much what we're trying to do is look at security considerations in all the components and states of a device. So, of course, this is going to be very implementation specific, thinking about how security is addressed with an oxygen pump compared to a pacemaker, compared to a surgical robot, compared to a PACS system. Every single one of these is going to have extremely different and unique considerations, which is why these can be so flexible.
Hey, let's take one step back here. I know we talked a little bit about operational states of a device with the last view and this one specifically with the updatability view and the security use case views. What are the primary operational states of a device?
The primary states that we usually factor in are power on, power off, standard operation, so like therapy administration, and standby, when the device is on, but it's not doing anything. We also have to think about some more edge case scenarios, such as updating. That can be an operational state of the device. Or
like it's in maintenance mode or something like that.
Yeah, maintenance mode. Are there any like break glass functionalities? Or do things work differently if you power it off altogether or move it into, say, like sleep mode, things like that?
So a state would be like, because some of the devices we work with they're in kiosk mode, but while they're booting up, they're not quite in kiosk mode until that function is enabled. So there's a window of time to exploit that device before kiosk mode comes up. So we're looking at all these sort of cases, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think kiosk mode is the perfect example, since that would be present during standby. That would be present during normal operation. But kiosk mode is usually managed by mobile device management tools, and those boot after the operating system. When a device is powering on, like if you reboot your laptop, before the operating system loads, it's loading in the BIOS, and that BIOS is loading into the operating system. So there is a window of time where the operating system hasn't loaded in yet. As such, the mobile device management hasn't loaded in yet. And then I'll go back to the situation you talked about earlier, where we can load in our own operating system. If we can redirect what that BIOS is doing without protections, we're going to go all the way around the considerations for the kiosk mode. We're just going to bypass it altogether and still get access to sensitive information.
Because we can change like the boot order in the BIOS if it's not password protected or somehow has security around it, what you're saying, and then make it boot off of our thumb drive.
Yep. And at that point, it's a pretty dangerous situation. We're able to access any information stored on the device in any way that we want to see it.
Cool.
Now, the FDA understands that saying any component or operational state of the device can be extremely broad. So they have some lengthy considerations in Appendix 2 in the Cybersecurity and Medical Devices guidance document that provides a lot more context on some of the things that manufacturers should consider when building out these security use case views. And this should address all reasonably foreseeable states, environments, and uses. Reasonably foreseeable is essentially anything that could be considered as normal and not just a completely absurd situation. For an example,
like an absurd situation would be the device has an anomaly and randomly crashes. While it's crashing, that state is not foreseeable. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, or something where you would never have to consider what those situations are like. So for an example, if we're looking at an MRI machine, we're never going to have to consider that under home use. We're always going to assume that that's in a hospital or a healthcare delivery organization. We're not going to assume that someone is using an MRI machine in their living room and what is the home network impact of compromise to that device. It's just a little bit of an absurd scenario. Now,
Fair enough.
with an oxygen pump, we can very easily consider it in a home environment and in a clinical environment. So sometimes that can change. And that's why we have to figure out what it is for this device specifically. All right. Now, this can be pretty broad and this can be pretty flexible, but some of the things that we want to do to just have a good starting point at minimum is start by mapping security use case views to active data flows in the device. The most important ones to consider are the external entry points. So this would be things like a USB port we can interact with, a Wi-Fi connection, Ethernet connection, Bluetooth, NFC, pretty much anything that we can physically interact with on the outside. Those should be our starting points. We also want to consider this for the internal components, though there can often be some more inherent security by the fact that they are buried inside the device and internal. For each of these views, for each of these data flows, we want to map them back to the operational states. So for every operational state that we can reasonably foresee in the device, how are these data flows working and how is security addressed? This gives us very easy traceability back to our global system views, where we can say there's a risk mapped to this specific component. We can tie it back into that global system view, and the FDA can see sort of the narrative that we're painting on how security has been addressed throughout that global system view through all of these more detailed views that we're going down from.
We've been talking quite a bit about data flow. From your experience, our team's experience with device manufacturers and the developers of the device, do most of them actually understand the data flow of the device?
So the manufacturers of the device do have, I would say for the most part, they have a fairly solid understanding of what it's doing from a functional perspective. But where the knowledge gap generally comes in is how security is going to be relevant. Understanding what a data flow is capable of. For an example, USB is another great example to bring up here. USB, first being universal, is meant to be a very flexible interface. It can deal with a lot of different protocols and a lot of different data transfers. Understanding how security maps to all of those can be really difficult, where understanding how the functional operation of all of those can be a lot easier. So I think that's a little bit of where the knowledge divide ends up happening with the manufacturing teams.
So one of the things I hear you talk about quite a bit, I know it's been an attack we've been able to pull off, is like a DICOM image. So that would be the data flow. If I have a system that ingests DICOM images, it has some AI component that does some analysis and image enhancement, and then sends a DICOM image back out to somebody else to look at, that's the data flow. And what controls will we need to have on that data flow to prevent, things like a bogus DICOM image from being ingested in that system and bogus output?
That's a great question. And DICOM's specifically a really difficult problem to cover due to the fact that it's such an old format and it has so many inherent vulnerabilities that can be a little bit difficult to bridge even with modern technology. When we're looking at something like that, the general rule with data flows and transfers is validation and verification on every end of the transfer. We want to verify that the information we're sending out is correct. So before it leaves and is in that active data flow state, when it's at the data store at the beginning end, we want to verify on the receiving end that we are receiving what we expect to see. This is the proper information that we should be capturing. It hasn't been modified in transit. So doing something like a CRC or a hash of a bit of information to verify that it has not been modified, and checking that hash on both ends can be a great way to verify that we have an intact bit of information. For something like DICOM, we can try stripping out certain functionality and verifying that it's still a DICOM image. It hasn't been ported over to an executable, which is weirdly a possible thing with that image file to turn it into an executable. It's a legacy requirement for the DICOM format that leads to all sorts of risk in devices. So considering things like that, verifying that it hasn't been tampered with, verifying that it hasn't been used in a risky way, verification, input validation, those are the main things that we should look at when we're addressing security and data flows.
I don't like this term, that zero trust thing people like to talk about, but essentially it sounds like that's what we're talking about here. We don't trust the output from any other system, so we have to verify it before we ingest it into our system before we do an analysis, because otherwise, we're making the mistake.
Exactly. We technically shouldn't even trust the input from our own systems. Like, we can go back to the updatability and patchability considerations.
True.
Our device should verify the update package pushed out by our update infrastructure. We control every component. We control the data flow. We still need to verify that it's secure.
So in that case, we may need to make sure that that patch is digitally signed with our certificate.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great example of how we can make sure that something is secure through a data flow transfer.
I guess that's true. We don't even trust ourselves, do we?
Exactly. Zero trust applies to us as well. All right. I want to go over some of the key points that we covered during this webinar. The first being just around the general architecture view. This can get very complicated and very lengthy depending on device complexity. More complicated systems are going to have more complicated architecture view considerations. I know we talked about the fact that the FDA is really pushing for updatability and patchability to be in devices, but some devices still don't have it. It isn't an explicit requirement at this point. So it may be that updatability views aren't ever going to be applicable. Global system views might just be a handful of components, or they might be thousands of different components interacting all together. Device complexity is going to dictate how complicated these architecture views should be. Another thing I want to discuss is that the FDA accepts multiple methods for capturing and submitting these views. You can do it as standalone documentation, or you can wrap it all into your threat modeling. Whichever approach is going to work the best for your organization and whichever approach is going to flow better for your team is our recommendation. Either is fully accepted and either is going to lead to similar results. Successful FDA submissions require that all four main types of architecture views are documented. Now, there may be some cases where a specific part of a view or a view altogether may not be applicable. We still need to address how it's not applicable, what considerations and what controls we have in place to remove that. We can never just go forward with an FDA submission saying, here are two of the four. The FDA is always going to come back asking for the other two. So we want to make sure that all four are covered in our documentation. Documentation for these architecture views is going to be unique across different devices and is going to have minimal overlap with other submissions. We often talk about what areas have overlap for various submissions, what can be reused from device A to device B, and there is a lot of that actually can be reused as part of an FDA submission. This is probably the most unique area, and this is where we're going to see the most distinction between different submissions. So we just want to make sure this is a note that you can't go back and forth and just use the same architecture considerations, use the same multi-patient harm views for different devices. It's always going to be very unique based on the device. This will tie a little bit into what I was mentioning about complexity, but detail and information should align with level of risk for the device. Higher risk profile devices need to have deeper considerations for security. We can go back to an example with an oxygen concentrator versus a drug infusion pump. If anything goes wrong with the drug infusion pump, that could lead to an overdose, that could lead to the denial of administration of therapy. There are a lot of bad things that can happen there, where an oxygen concentrator may lead to some discomfort, but likely wouldn't lead to a life or death situation. These risk profiles need to be considered when we're tying in the level of documentation and the level of detail to these architecture views.
I just want to clarify something. So you could have a super complex device that could actually be low risk. The theory you gave was like the oxygen pump versus a drug infusion pump. They're both fairly complex, but it's really about the risk to the patient and some of the complexity that drive the amount of documentation we need in these use cases. These are architecture views, sorry.
Exactly. So a great example would be image enhancement. This is a very popular product class, especially with how prevalent AI is right now. But there's a very minimal risk associated with it in a lot of cases. Since generally it's used as clinical decision support as opposed to creating a diagnosis, it's just trying to add clarity or refinement to an already existing image and already existing information. Now, having said that, from a device complexity, these systems can get extremely complicated very, very quickly, but the risk profile is going to be a lot lower compared to, say, a pacemaker, which is very simple from a complexity standpoint, but extremely complicated from a risk perspective. So those are the two areas that we factor in here.
Yeah, and that clinical decision support, I think, is a great area to kind of bypass some of the controls.
Pretty much. Yeah, it's saying, oh, we're not actually making the decision with the device. We're still pushing this on to the clinician, which we are. It goes back to our conversations that we've always had around, where can blame be assigned if something goes wrong with a device like this? It's essentially off moving part of that over onto the clinician or onto the therapist, who should act as the final stop and the final decision maker throughout the process. If a device itself is making the decision, then that device essentially has to inherit the responsibility if it makes the wrong decision. This is why these considerations can be extremely deep for, say, IVD machines, where they're often trying to actually make a diagnosis compared to something that is providing clinical decision support.
Awesome. Anything else to add to the webinar today, Trevor? We would cover everything pretty well.
Those are some of the main points that we wanted to cover. We talked about the different architecture views that the FDA wants to see captured as part of the regulatory documentation and submission. We went into some details on those 4 views: the global system view, multi-patient harm view, updatability and patchability view, and security use case views. And then we talked about some of the tips and tricks to make sure that your submission goes smoothly and you're able to fully capture these as part of your documentation.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to our monthly webinar. Be sure and tune in next month.